Hello and thanks for opening this video, which will demonstrate just quite how improbable it is that the similarities between my creation Tribus and Sky TV's Britannia could be coincidental. If you haven't seen the videos comparing the two shows, then please follow the links in the description below. I am using screenshots from Britannia in this video in accordance with UK copyright law, as it's intended both for instructional purposes and review. In a short while, I'll be briefly analysing the odds of each of the corresponding story beats in the two shows' respective wedding scenes, considering the likelihood that two independent writers would have made each of those creative choices during the development of the two final scripts. Before that, it's important to point out the often complex nature of a story's development, as alluded to by one of my heroes, Terence Winter. I'd studied his process and career in great detail when I started to work on my own original drama, and it largely informed my development. Like Winter, I dissected a number of shows' pilot episodes, writing down the beats of each in order to understand the dramatic structure that underpinned their narrative. In terms of my own treatment, I ended up writing hundreds of pages over 2.5 years, including several drafts of my pilot script. But as I did so, I was faced with a seemingly infinite amount of creative choices to make along the way. How will I introduce my main character? When should I make my antagonist turn bad? What would be my inciting incident? I ended up with a body of work that I was told by a number of professionals was ready to take to the market. But the point I'm trying to make is that to reach that point, I'd put in hundreds, possibly thousands of hours of deliberation into my story's development. So moving on to the analysis. The first thing that needs to be pointed out to people not familiar with story development is the importance of what's known as the inciting incident. This is essentially the moment of dramatic action that hooks the viewer into the story, or in my case show, and sets a hero or group of protagonists against an opposing force. Both Tribus and Britannia have highly similar structures and multiple protagonists, including groups in the form of tribes. And what I'd consider to be the main inciting incident in both shows' first seasons occurs at a wedding. This pits the two main tribes against each other for the entirety of each show. Now, I'm happy to admit, because of course it's true, that featuring a wedding in a historical drama is one of those elements that you're highly likely to see, at least at some point. But to have a wedding that goes wrong in some shape as the key inciting incident in a show's first episode is, as I know only too well, far from the only option a writer could choose from. To prove my point, and this is documented, I asked the Writers Helping Writers group on Facebook, with 200,000 odd members, to come up with such a key plot point. From the scores of replies, some with numerous suggestions, not a single person came up with a wedding. For that reason, and whilst acknowledging that a wedding is still a distinct possibility, I think a 1 in 10 chance of selection is certainly more than fair. After all, and as I've proved, there are certainly a lot more than 10 options to choose from. Moving on, another area of key relevance to the untrained eye is the fact that in both shows it's established that there has been an issue between the protagonistic tribe and the Regini or Regni, who are of course one and the same, prior to the wedding. Britannia does this retrospectively. Ultimately in both, it's the Regini or Regni who are blamed for it going wrong, which leads to the conflict between them. Again, this is a vital part of the dramatic structure in both, a vital part to the story I created. In order to understand the likelihood of the Regini being involved is the fact that in Britannia's timeline, starting in 43 AD, they weren't actually thought to have existed. At the very best, historians considered them to have been a client tribe of the Atrebates. So why did they use them? In my show, which has a wider timeline than Britannia's, it considers the Regini to be a smaller tribe that get all but decimated prior to the invasion, caused by the wedding, and then returning to a position of power after the Romans had established a foothold, so certainly a lot more closer to what we know from the historical records. Of course, Britannia's creators can say that their story is entirely fictionalized, but the fact that they've opted to portray a real tribe who weren't considered to have been in existence when the Romans invaded, simply makes no sense when you're fictionalizing an important yet unknown part of British history. For that reason, I'd give odds of 5 to 1 at best that the Regini are involved in the weddings at all. Next, let's quickly consider the all but identical setting of the weddings, which were not based on any known from the history books. Putting aside what I've just mentioned about the Regini's existence in 43 AD, and the fact that Britannia's Canti tribe were also widely believed to have been subjugated by my protagonists, the Catafalauni or Cassi as I've called them, is the simple fact that both weddings are set, very specifically, on the borders of tribal lands. When I consider where I could have set my wedding, 4 clear choices come to mind. 1 in the protagonist's capital or settlement, 2 in the antagonist's, 3 in a druid's temple or henge, and 4 somewhere neutral, such as the borders. Putting aside the specificity of the use of the word borders, there's a clear 1 in 4 choice for this point. Once it's established that the wedding will be on the borders, a tree circle is one of the choices you could set it in or next to, for sure. But so too is within a henge or on top of hills looking across both territories, or next to an idyllic stream with butterflies dancing and daisies. You get the idea. I'd say therefore that there's a 1 in 3 chance, and that's being generous, that a writer would have made that choice. Now that we've chosen a wedding as the inciting incident, on the borders, in a tree circle, for a show about the tribes of ancient Britain, I'm happy to admit that a number of the beats I'd written could fairly be expected or even had to have happened. All of these points, and thanks to the inside pitch for the term, can be considered as essential à la scenes of air, excuse my French. I'll give these even odds for the sake of the argument. But whilst it's an almost certainty that there'd have been a bride in traditional Celtic bridal wear, it's only highly likely, and not definite, that she would be in her mid-20s and highly attractive, as she is in both shows. Think of poor Walder Frey, for example. So a 1.5 in 1 chance that the brides are so similar, at least, in terms of age and description. Bearing in mind that your time really is precious, I'll just run through the rest of the beats that appear in both, without going into the thought process behind how I came up with most of them. A couple of final beats to add before my conclusion. Within my script for the first episode, the bride ends up getting captured by the Gaul and held by him and his men as a temporary prisoner, which also happens within the wedding scene of Britannia. So I am going to include these points as they are highly relevant, but not some others that I'll briefly mention. I'll give the odds of these things happening as 1 in 2. The problem with comments like those being shown is that it's easy for a viewer to focus on the individual moments they see on screen and consider them as something that a writer would have likely come up with. But of course, if they'd have seen something truly unlikely happening, such as a spaceship coming down and killing the bride, then the drama would lose its authenticity. Quite simply, whatever choice myself or any other writer had to have taken at each of the aforementioned steps is that there'd have had to have been something believable, something authentic. Neither Britannia or Tribus was science fiction, but the main problem with focusing just on the individual moments is the fact that you end up losing sight of the bigger picture. All of the aforementioned are connected. As a storyteller, they came together after careful consideration to form a narrative. So rather than consider them as a viewer and what you see, one should consider them as a writer and the choices that were taken along the way. And not only that, but you need to consider them as a whole. They're all vital parts, or occur in the same scene, and at the same moment in a story, set in roughly the same era and place. Thanks to the mathematicians I've consulted, teachers and lecturers, as well as a professor who I double-checked the theory with, we can use a simple formula to calculate the odds of 2 independent events happening. The formula is very simple. Imagine you want to calculate the odds of throwing a 6 3 times on the trot. All you need to do is work out the odds of throwing it once, which is 1 in 6. Throwing it a second time is independent of the first, so it's 1 in 6 again, as is the third time. In order to calculate the likelihood that you would throw 3 6s in a row, you simply multiply the odds together. Now, because the creators of Britannia, care of James Richardson, have denied seeing or knowing about the contents of my script, they're claiming the creative choices they made were taken independently of mine. But when we apply the formula that calculates the likelihood of this, using all the odds I've come up with fairly in this video, and then, as the formula dictates, multiplying them all together, you will see why this is simply all but an impossibility. Remember, this isn't a subjective opinion, it's just the maths. According to the numbers, 150 million to 1 or so, if you couldn't count the zeros, it would be something of a minor miracle that two writers would have come up with all those story beats for the same inciting incident, in the same scene, in a show with a nearly identical synopsis, characters and themes, at almost exactly the same moment in time. Yes, there are some differences. The Gaul is initially aligned to the protagonist tribe in Britannia. The groom in their show dies just before the groom in mine, and in a different way. They've all got different names. But as I've discussed elsewhere, a creator or scriptwriter can expect to see changes to their work when they do get the credit. If someone was going to take the ideas of an original story and not give its creator the credit, could we honestly expect the two to remain identical? That would be absurd. For the record, there are other elements that I could have included related to the scene which would have made the odds even greater. But at 150 million or so to 1, I think I've proved my point. And remember, the similarities aren't just related to this one scene, as my lead video demonstrates. They're seen throughout the all-important first episode of Britannia, from which the rest of that show spawned, and beyond. The simple fact that the only person who ever had a copy of my script, outside of a university submission, denied saying they'd give James Richardson a copy, and even denied knowing him, says it all. In her email, denying he was a contact, she wrote that she understood why I'd be desperate to get to the bottom of it. Actually, I'm not. The numbers speak for themselves, and it's pretty obvious what happened. All I want now is the credits for 2.5 years of my life's work, and all that should have come with them in the first place. Well, that's just about all. Thanks for watching until the end, it really does mean a lot to me. If you've got any queries about how I came up with the odds, or thoughts in general, please leave them in the comments section below. And if you could like and share the video, or subscribe to my channel, it really would be a massive help. Cheers.